So, and then I also have Sister Fadwa Simi, who is a Palestinian American who's lived in Palestine. Her parents are from Palestine. And so I thought it was important to have particularly a female Palestinian voice, because so much of the suffering that has been inflicted of late is on the women and on their children. And then hopefully we'll have Sister Hala Hijazi towards the end of this program. The first thing I want to ask you, because I know you know this book, and I don't know if you're familiar with or have ever read him, but Hilaire Belloc wrote a book called The Crisis of Civilization back in the 30s. But one of the things that he said that he thought there were some postulates that were necessary whenever you wanted to look at global developments historically, great social developments historically. And his first postulate was that truth lies in proportion. And what he meant by that, he said, was that you do not tell a historical truth by merely stating a known fact, nor even by stating a number of facts in certain and true order. You can tell it justly only by stating the known things in the order of their values. In other words, in relation to other things. So, you know, the idea of proportion being the relation of things to other things. And one of the things that really strikes me about this crisis because, you know, there's the material war, the physical war that inflicts so much suffering, but then there's this propaganda war that is so effective and has been effective for a really long time. And I just, you know, the example he uses is if you ask somebody, you know, who was Shakespeare, who doesn't know who Shakespeare is, and you say, well, he was this guy that wrote plays back in the 16th and 17th century. You know, he says, that's not untrue, it's a fact, but it doesn't tell you truthfully who Shakespeare is. You have to relate him in relation to the other playwrights of the English language and conclude that he's the greatest playwright in the English language. That is a more accurate picture of getting to the truth of who that man is, as opposed to just stating a fact. And I think there's so many facts are stated about this issue. So what I want to ask you first, especially in light of Dr. Khalidi's book, like, what do you think in terms of the facts to put them in a proper proportionality? You know, how would you state this, what this conflict is really about?
Well, I think, Rashid, I think it's an important book because the patterns of this settler colonial project haven't changed since they began. So you have historic Palestine, you have the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire in the wake of World War I. Now, those who live within historic Palestine, as is true, I mean, all the way out throughout the Middle East, for 20 centuries are under Ottoman rule. You have the rise of nationalist movements and national identity. That is true for the Zionists, who begin their settler colonial project after the war through British patronage, but it's also true for the Palestinians. So you go from this moment where on the eve of World War I, only 6% of the population in historic Palestine were Jewish, and most of them, by the way, were not Zionists. And you through the patronage of the British Empire, and of course they see these settlers as essentially furthering British policy, British control. The Balfour Declaration, I think the 1917, it recognizes the right of this Jewish minority to settle and have a place within historic Palestine, and doesn't even mention the Palestinians by name. That's the inception. And then what I think Khalidi does very well in the book is show the patterns by which the Palestinians have essentially been cursed over this century. First is they don't have adequate patronage. In many ways, the Arab regimes, including their neighboring regimes, will at best pay lip service to their oppression and often sell them out. The big case would be King Abdullah in then Transjordan, it becomes Jordan, where he cuts a deal with the Zionist militias to take the West Bank through his his British trained and British led, the officer corps was British, army. You have eventually Egypt and Sadat. You have everything from the Camp David Agreement to Oslo, the Abraham Accords. It's a constant. They're constantly betrayed by their own. That's one pattern that Rashid points out. The second pattern is also from the beginning, and that's deception on the part of the Zionists. Privately, within their own correspondence, with the exception of Jabotinsky's, you have Jabotinsky, who Mussolini, by the way, called a good fascist, and that strain of Jewish fascism is also an element within the Zionist movement. It was given expression when I lived in Jerusalem through Meir Kahane, this racist, violent rabbi. Interestingly, he was assassinated finally, but when I was in Israel in 1994, they outlawed his Koch party. And what we're seeing now in the Netanyahu government is essentially the proteges of Kahane have seized power. So you always had this strain of, for lack of a better term, overt Jewish fascism, but you always had this strain of deception. You talked about propaganda. And we know from, for instance, the private correspondence of Chaim Weissman, that they knew very well, David Ben-Gurion, all of these figures understood that the idea, as in any settler colonial project, it was to seize the land and displace the indigenous population. The other pattern that Rashid points out correctly is that the Palestinians have just been cursed with inadequate leadership, whereas many of the Zionist leaders actually came from the West. Abba Eban, who I knew, educated at Oxford, Golda Meir lived in the United States. She was an immigrant, but they understood the cultures that they were dealing with. They were able to read the kind of geopolitical scene. I mean, for instance, the Zionists, which clashed with the British at World War I with the White Paper, so they curtailed Jewish immigration because they needed support of the Arab world. They understood that geopolitics or power, or that was shifting away from Britain to the United States. And the third pattern is the essential inability on the part of the Palestinians to ever build effective resistance movements. Now, Rashid points out, I think correctly, that repression, because remember, up till the Arab Revolt, which I think was the Palestinian Revolt, which I think was 1937, and by the way, the British deployed 100,000 troops. They armed Jewish militias to crush this. I think 1 out of 4 Palestinians were either killed or wounded or displaced. I mean, this was all before the Nakba. So the inability on the part of the Palestinians, that revolt, it came too early in a way.
Right.
They missed their historical moment. And then, of course, we end today with, and I think that this is what happens with all settler colonial projects, is what they cannot crush that resistance. They engage in open acts of genocide, which is what I would describe happening in Gaza. So the great thing about that book is that it hits those patterns which have kind of bedeviled the Palestinians up until the present moment, all of which, and of course I spent 7 years covering Palestine, much of that time in Gaza, and I can assure you the Israelis lie like they breathe. I mean, their primary job of the propaganda machine was to discredit whatever it was we reported on the ground.
Right. Just I'm going to get to something, but before that, one of the books, because, all I've been doing in the last almost 2 months now is just going through several books on this subject, like a real deep dive. But one of the books that really shocked me is this, The British Pacification of Palestine. So this is the British Army, the colonial state, and the Arab Revolt, 1936 to 1939. And one of the things that was fascinating, because I think what shocked a lot of people, and you actually had Palestinians flying Irish flags
Yeah, well, because the techniques that were used to subdue
It all came from
Irish
Ireland.
were used against Palestine. There are many cases it's the same British officers.
Yeah, it's amazing. So you have these like the home demolitions, that was all Irish, British practice, English practice in Ireland. The assassinations of the leadership. But one of the things that really, I mean, uh, Piers Morgan recently said, well, the Irish situation gives us some hope, neglecting the fact that it took them 700 years,
Right.
to get where they've gotten, but I think the fact that so many of these techniques are, I think they're so antiquated and anachronistic in terms of the general tenor around the globe. There's so many people that are so horrified by these things that were standard practice in a lot of the pre-modern world. Like, I think there was just much more of this, but now there's just a real backlash. But one of the things I wanted to ask you, I was curious about the fact that he didn't really go into the Christian Zionism, because one of the things that really strikes me as fascinating about this is that the Christians have more to do with the establishment of the state of Israel than the actual Jews did. Shaftesbury, and even back, this is like 200 years. It goes way back, which is a kind of English Christian heresy. This idea we have to get all the Jews back to hasten the apocalypse, so that Jesus can come back. And I was just really struck by the fact that these Zionist Christians like Balfour and there were several of them that were just, I think, hell-bent on making this thing happen. But one of the things that Dr. Thomas Cleary thought, and he's by far the smartest human being I've ever met, but he actually thought that at the root of it was a deep anti-Semitism, that they really wanted to kind of deal with what used to be called the Jewish question, this idea of this problem of the alien within our midst. And they believed in a lot of these conspiracy theories. But he saw it as just a really vicious thing to do, to put them in the midst of a place in this kind of colonial settler environment amidst people that are obviously going to react at having their land taken from them, and the fact that they have the support of now over 1 billion people on the planet. But I was just curious, why do you think that, obviously he can't write everything, why he chose 1917 when it really begins, the Aliyah begins in 1882, and 1913 and 14 were critical years in this conflict. So I'm just curious.
He uses it because of the Balfour Declaration, which formalizes the project and begins the flood of Jewish immigration. Remember, Allenby was also a Christian Zionist, the first
Right. Yeah.
who defeated the Ottomans. A lot of fighting, by the way, in Gaza in World War I. So, yeah, that Christian Zionism was an important component because it built allies. And I think you're right that if you really explore it, it is anti-Semitic in the same way that the Christian right in the United States is anti-Semitic. And more explicitly within the Christian right in the United States, because at the end times, I think it's 160,000 Jews or something are saved and the rest are incinerated with everyone else. So it is a kind of bizarre, mythical vision that has always been part of, within the Christian rubric. But yes, it was this alliance. And I don't think there's any secret that the British aristocracy, the Christian British aristocracy, did not really want Jews in Britain. And you had much the same if you look at the early years of Abraham Lincoln. There was all that discussion of moving African Americans back to Africa, to Madagascar or Liberia, or wherever it was. So yes, I think you're right that the Jews for them were a kind of caricature, which had kind of wrapped in a kind of biblical or Christian mythology. I think that's right.
Yeah, the other thing, this really struck me, is that is the fact that so many of these early Jews were totally opposed to Zionism, and in fact, the overwhelming majority of practicing Jews in particular, because as you know, I mean, the Zionists, Herzl and Weizmann, I mean, they were arch secularists. They did not, and in the Jewish state, which is a fascinating read, but in the Jewish state, he actually talks about settling Argentina. Like there was plenty of land there, and maybe they could all go to Argentina. It was a good climate, but then he says, but there's a kind of romantic attachment to a lot of the Jews have to Palestine. So maybe we could convince the Sultan of the Hamid to, if we get rid of all his debts, that he'll just give us the land, which is interesting now with the debt forgiveness being offered to Egypt, right? If they'll take in so I just thought that was fascinating. But one of the things that really struck me was already, and there's a lot of arguments that are made against, this idea there was never any Palestinian people. Well, there was really not a Jewish nationalistic idea either. And you cannot argue that Solomon's empire was a kind of nationalistic, in a modern nation state idea. But the Palestinians were actually developing a pretty serious national identity very early and using the term Philistini, which was more of a geographical term for them, like how the Philistini, like he's Shami or he's Lebanese. It was used in the Ottoman period like that. But I thought it was very interesting that the British during the Mandate allowed the Zionists to really create a state within a state. They were already functioning by the mid-30s as a state, and yet the Palestinians, they would not allow them to develop their government institutions at that time, even though they had them at the time of the Ottomans. I mean, you had the Alami, Musa Alami was the mayor of Jerusalem. They had courts of law. They had very serious institutions in the country, but the British did not allow them, while at the same time they were clearly allowing the Zionists to build up, including the Haganah, building up really a paramilitary, which eventually becomes the IDF. I think, Jabotinsky's, I mean, that was his brainchild.
Right. I mean, the Palestinians did have them, and it wasn't so much, you're right that they banned them, and of course they banned Palestinian newspapers and all this kind of stuff, but it was that they refused to grant them any legitimacy, any legal status. And especially with the Palestinian revolt, the British not only arm Zionist militias, but going back to your point about house demolitions, targeted assault, they taught those counterinsurgency techniques that they had used in India, used in Ireland. They taught them to these Zionist leaders who use them to this day. So yeah, there was a complete erasure of Palestinian identity under the British mandate. And that wasn't done for altruism or any love of Jews. It was done because they saw the Jewish minority as an effective arm of colonial control. And up until 1939, that was true. And then, of course, when they had to limit, because they realized that the war was going to be fought throughout the Middle East and they needed allies, when they limited Jewish immigration into Palestine, then the Jewish terrorist groups, the Stern Gang and these others, carried out all sorts of terrorist attacks, not only against Palestinians, but against the British, including blowing up the headquarters of at the King David Hotel, killing, I can't remember what it was, 61 or something British.
I think there were 92, I think it was that, yeah.
So But at the same time, the Zionists very astutely pivoted, and they found a new patron in the United States.
Right.
And that is again a theme of Rashid's book, that because, and this, he would even argue, and this was, I knew Arafat, of course, that this was also true within the PLO, that they understood perhaps the Arab world, but they really didn't understand much outside the confines of the Arab world, and that has always hampered the Palestinians, their resistance movements, whereas so much of the Zionist leadership is actually drawn. I mean, Netanyahu is a case in point, raised in Philadelphia, went to MIT, and so the Palestinians have always been hampered, Rashid would argue in his book, I think correctly, by never having roots. Now that's changing with the next generation. So we see all of these protests, which are very heartening, mostly by very young, I mean, young by my standards, in their 20s, I mean, kids who are bilingual and bicultural. And that, of course, is terrifying to the Israeli state, which is why they work so hard to outlaw, as they have at Columbia, Students for Justice in Palestine, along with Jewish Voices for Peace. It's why they go after the BDS activists on campus, not because these campuses are even remotely considering divesting or imposing sanctions or anything else, but because as an educational tool, it's been so effective. And as they lose support among the new generation of Jews who don't have that old emotional attachment to, what Amir Haas calls fantasy Israel, as they lose that attachment, then of course they build stronger and stronger alliances with the Christian Zionists, the Christian right, who are, number one, anti-Semitic, and number two, I would argue, essentially the face of American fascism.
Interesting, yeah. And I think another thing that's been really extraordinary, and Dr. Khalidi definitely mentions this towards the end of the book, that he felt that it was very important for the Israeli Jews also to that they have to come up and really recognize what's been happening. But what's been really powerful, I think, in the U.S. is so many of the Jewish community in this country has shown up. I mean, a lot of these protests have been from within the Jewish community, and I think that this younger generation is just, they're seeing a whole different perspective. I think, obviously the Palestinian resistance has made a lot of egregious mistakes that we would all hopefully agree on. But I think people are recognizing that, Alden, I and the public both know what all school children must learn: those to whom evil is done, do evil in return. And I think people really forget that the Palestinians historically are profoundly peaceful people. If you actually look in the 19th century, there were over 3,000 published travel logs by visitors to Palestine from Europe that were visiting the Holy Lands. Over 3,000. None of them mention violence or having some horrific time because of the belligerence of the people. They, historically, they have been a profoundly welcoming people to other people, and that's why there's so many really ethnic groups that have kind of come into that land from different places. I mean, you have Circassians, you have the Maghariba, which the Moroccan quarter that was actually destroyed, I think in '67. That was a historical quarter where you had all of these Moroccans who had migrated to be in the Holy Land, to be near the Haram Sharif. So I think it's I don't know. I think it's hopeful in that sense that you really do see a tide turning, just in recognizing that there has to be a just solution to this crisis.
Yeah, I think Rashid makes a very good point, because and he juxtaposes the first Intifada with the second Intifada. I covered both of them. So the first Intifada was largely nonviolent. But the point he makes, like with the March of Return, where you had a largely nonviolent protest along the security barrier separating Gaza from Israel, and you had Israeli snipers shooting journalists, shooting medics, shooting children, and he makes the point that in fact the repression on the part of pre-1948, post-1948 by Israel or by the Zionists is always worse against the nonviolent movement because it's so hard to demonize than the Palestinians. So what you had in the Second Intifada were the use of suicide bombings on buses. I covered several of them. And I remember I knew two of the leaders of Hamas. I knew Abdelaziz Rantisi, I knew Nizar Rayan, both of whom were assassinated. And I had dinner at Rantisi's house more than once. His wife was just killed. His widow was just killed a couple of weeks ago. And I remember he was a very thoughtful, came out of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, was a physician, educated in Egypt. And we dealt with the issue of suicide bombing. And my argument was that, yes, it was, that the violence that was committed by Israel against the Palestinians in terms of numbers and savagery, there was no comparison. But I said, by doing that, you lose the moral high ground that you have. And his argument back was, we'll stop killing their children when they stop killing our children. And of course, far more Palestinian children have been killed.
Not much of an argument, not a moral argument, certainly. It's interesting.
No.
Yeah. Ismail Abu Shanab, who was one of the founding members, was actually opposed to it and thought it was not a wise thing, but I think he succumbed to the majority vote. But I think that's, for me, I've always been opposed to that. And I really believe by the Sharia of Islam would never, I genuinely believe that it would never sanction suicide bombing. Least of all reasons is it opens the door to deeply depressed people to commit suicide in a kind of noble way, quote unquote. I think it's very clear that from this book, one of the things that really affected me was Iqbal Ahmed's assessment of the idea of violent resistance and the fact that they brought him in, and this guy, he was in the Algerian Revolution. He was a compatriot with Frantz Fanon, and he actually did support violent resistance to settler colonialism. But he thought it was a completely untenable strategy for the Palestinians because of the historicity of their own narrative of suffering and the Holocaust. And I think one of the most fascinating aspects to me of the effectiveness of the Israeli perspective is that they have made it David and Goliath, but they're the David and the Palestinians are the Goliath. And I find that so amazing that kind of leisure domain could actually pass muster, because the British knew that they wouldn't win 48. That was already in all of their documents, even though the British backed the Palestinians in that war and gave them the weapons and things. But they knew that they had totally ineffective leadership. They knew that they were militarily completely incapable. And they also knew 67, 73. I mean, it's just amazing that they've known that the superiority militarily of this country has been so massively asymmetrical. And yet, people really think the Palestinians somehow are an existential threat to the Israeli people.
Yeah, it's even worse than that, Hamza. I mean, you have Netanyahu calling them the new Nazis. So it's not just the David and Goliath narrative, which is ridiculous. The Palestinians don't have artillery. They don't have mechanized units. They don't have an air force. They don't have naval guns. They don't have Hellfire missiles. They don't have attack helicopters. They're trapped in let's call it what it is, a concentration camp, being leveled as we speak. And of course, you can't even describe that, I would argue, as a war. it's the language that's used is not only a distortion in terms of the balance of power, but it's the way Palestinians are dehumanized and demonized and painted as a kind of absolute evil. I mean, if you see the media when they describe Israeli victims from October 7th, and these were certainly horrible, many cases, atrocities, it's always a doctor or a teacher or a mother. But the Palestinians they're not individualized. They're a dehumanized mass. We don't hear about Palestinian poets or this or and of course we had the New York Times, my former employer, run an editorial, which I just couldn't believe it when I read it, saying there shouldn't be a ceasefire. It was remarkable.
Yeah, I think the aspect of the warmongering element, just this idea somehow that that there's some level of proportionality here, and that also there's another narrative that really I think troubles me deeply, that people still seem to be able to say it with a straight face. This idea that we don't target civilians, and the idea, one of the things that they use, and I've seen this in several interviews, is they use the Dresden bombings as this kind of moral justification. Like, the West bombed Dresden to get rid of the Nazis, but they targeted specifically civilians, and that was somehow acceptable in the West. And then they make the argument that we don't specifically target civilians, and so there's no moral equivalency here. One of the things, I don't know if you've had a chance to see that book, but it's by A.C. Grayling, Among the Dead Cities.
Yeah, I know it.
Yeah, and so he makes an argument, and I thought this was really fascinating. He makes an argument that the reason in 1977 that the Geneva Convention Protocol 1 of 1977, it was actually addressed to deal with the fact that they came to terms that aerial bombardment was criminal activity. That in essence, bombing civilians is a war crime. And Grayling makes an argument that Churchill was guilty of war crimes, and that it was morally unjustifiable. And he actually makes an argument that the bombers should have refused to bomb civilian targets. And one of the fascinating things to me was that Simpson, when the US chose to use nuclear weapons on the Japanese, they chose two largely civilian populations, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but they actually originally intended to blow up Kyoto, which is, I've visited Kyoto. It's one of the most beautiful cities in the world. But Simpson argued against it because he had actually visited Kyoto and was so struck by how beautiful it was that he said it would be a crime to destroy that city. So it's not a crime to destroy, tens of thousands of people, but to destroy these works of art would be a crime. And I think this distortion, this moral distortion that seems so evident, the fact that that's missed on so many people, I don't know. I read Sven Lindqvist's book, History of Aerial Bombardment, and the first bombings were actually done by the Italians on Bedouin in Libya, and they just dropped bombs on Bedouins to see if it worked or not. And then Churchill used them to test the British airplanes on Iraqi Bedouin. Like, the Italians, that's a good idea. Let's see if it works with our planes as well. So they actually just bombed, and that gets to I don't like to use the race card, but the overt racism and this Eurocentric superiority is just another thing that seems to me so profoundly evident. And I think that's why so many young people are rejecting this narrative, because I think a lot of them are coming to terms with a lot of the painful aspects of European and also Canadian American and South American history.
Yeah, and you talked about the way Israel. I mean, they use euphemisms to describe mass murder, which, of course, as somebody who was reporting, I've been in Gaza when it was hit by Israeli warplanes. So Israeli children who are murdered are caught in the crossfire, or when they bomb houses and apartment blocks, it's a surgical strike on a bomb-making factory, or when they destroy Palestinian homes, it's the demolition of the homes of terrorists. I mean, it's just completely predictable. So we would report these events, and that was always how it was countered, with these kind of, this kind of double think or logic against logic, which Orwell writes about. And I think that these lies, which of course abolish any kind of ambiguity or nuance. They don't permit any gray zones. It's a kind of cognitive dissonance which feeds into the Israeli narrative of good and evil, black and white. And I think that those lies are important, and we've seen them all around Gaza, because the Israelis need them in order to, and they want to believe them. There's a kind of thirst for them, and it feeds their kind of moral superiority, that kind of logic-proof compartment of dogmatic adherence, Edward Bernays writes. And they don't want, you have a population, much like the American population over Iraq and Afghanistan, they don't really want to know the truth, because the truth would force them to look at some very unpleasant aspects of themselves and their society. And then finally, I think that those lies send a very ominous message to the Palestinians, because Israelis are saying, in essence, we will wage a campaign of mass terror and genocide, and we will never take responsibility for our crimes. So it obliterates in one fell swoop the kind of dignity of human thought, human action, obliterates facts, obliterates history, obliterates hope, and it essentially reduces the entire dialogue to one of violence. So why did the hijackers on 9/11 carry out attacks against the World Trade Center and the Pentagon? Because they understood that huge explosions and death in a city skyline are how you communicate. That's how we have been communicating to the world, for decades. Robert McNamara, when he orders the saturation bombing of Vietnam, called it sending a message to the North Vietnamese. And in many ways, it's the same phenomena, where Israel, they call it mowing the lawn, but it's about sending a message. And as you quoted Auden, I mean, you look at any national revolt, and they're very ugly. I mean, C.L.R. James, when he writes about the Haitian uprising, the only successful slave revolt in human history, and Haiti's been paying for it ever since, they tortured, it was very brutal to the French planter slaveholding class, in the same way that during the Nat Turner Rebellion, Nat Turner and his followers, also, by the way, religious zealots, murdered every white that they saw. Even the French Revolution, remember, they were, severing the heads of clergy and aristocrats and putting them on pikes and carrying them through the streets of Paris. So that's not in any way to defend, what happened on October 7th. But we have to understand. To understand is not to condone.
Right.
Keep people trapped in an open-air prison or a concentration camp for 16 years and humiliate them and impoverish them and shoot them as if they were beasts and not expect this kind of response.
Well, I think also one of the things that Dr. Khalidi points out is that, Hamas, who had used, obviously, these against civilians, which is a war crime, whether it comes from the Israelis or from the Arabs, to attack civilians is a war crime in Islam as well as in just international law. But one of the things that he points out is that when they were elected in 2006, they were actually surprised that they won, but they toned down a lot of their rhetoric and basically were willing to kind of enter into, in a similar fashion, the way, Michael Collins. And it's interesting that the Zionists and I think a lot of the Arab resistance both saw the Irish rebellion as in fact, Yitzhak Shamir, he actually used Michael as his code name after Michael Collins. So the Zionists saw the RIA as a kind of a model when they were using terrorist tactics against the British. But what was interesting was they did not allow Hamas to have any participation in a political process. That immediately they got the PLO to attempt to take over the place, and that you have that civil war. I don't know if you were around. Were you in Gaza at any time during that period?
I was in Gaza when Arafat came back.
That was 2001.
And what Bill wanted was a colonial police force,
right?
Which of course they get under Abbas.
Yeah,
that's why he has no support. And those were, by every account, free elections, 2006. And then not only did they set up the siege, but they also tried to carry out a failed coup d'etat to overthrow it. And I think we should note that from its inception, going all the way back, there have been negotiations with Egyptian intermediaries between the Israeli leadership and Hamas. And I would also say that when you look closely at the violations of the ceasefires that have been in place, it's almost always Israel that's violated them, because they're looking for a provocation that gives them an ability to quote unquote mow the lawn, to carry out egregious bombing campaigns that leave thousands of Palestinian civilians dead or wounded.
Well, one of the arguments that's been made is like, this is what they voted for. Whereas the elections, which were in 2005, there hasn't been elections since. They only got 44% of the actual vote in Gaza. And largely it was due to the fact that people were so frustrated with the corruption that they were seeing in the PA. And almost, I think over half of this population wasn't even alive when that election took place. Right. And I think I'd like to hear also from Fadwa about her own experience in the Intifada, because the levels of frustration and the attempts at using peaceful, because there have been, as there have been serious nonviolent attempts at addressing this issue, and they've really been brutally. That guy Bassem Tamimi, I think, I think he's in Hebron, Khalil, and he was like totally nonviolent, like didn't even believe in violence, and he was considered, an agitator, and the fact that it's like 400,000 or more have been arrested. I mean, if we think of those numbers, 400,000. I mean, that out of the 4 million people, that's a huge number of people that have experienced incarceration, interrogation, and a lot of it without habeas corpus, without, it's pretty shocking. And then the children also, the fact that there's been so many of these children. So, but can you talk a little bit about maybe just about your own experience during the Intifada, what you saw?
Sure. So I was born in San Francisco, but my family moved to Palestine in 1986. I was 10, and I was a student at the Friends Quaker School in Ramallah, but living in Beit Hanina. So when the first Intifada started, the checkpoints were set up between the West Bank and Jerusalem. We'd have to cross into Ramallah to go to school. And was interesting for us as children. We experienced our schools getting tear gassed, shot at. We saw, soldiers in the streets in Ramallah shooting at. Once if they shut down schools and checkpoints, we had to figure out a way to get past checkpoints to get back home. And I was 11, grew up in the Bay Area. And this is something that we had to figure out how to do with our schoolmates, a lot of them a lot younger than us. But I think what was most impactful for us was picking up tear gas canisters in our village, turning them around and seeing "Made in the USA." And what that meant for us as, having been born in the United States and now living in our homeland of Palestine, it sort of sets up this, what does it really mean? What does it mean for us? Witnessing our schools were completely shut down by the springtime, and realizing that education was being used as a weapon. Like, we were denied schooling as children because there's power in knowledge, and understanding that even though we didn't have schools, we still needed to figure out a way to study and learn. So just as a young child being exposed to occupation, being exposed to soldiers, visiting in the summers, seeing settlers with AK-47s on their shoulders, as just walking in the streets, and what that meant for us. I was also there in the second Intifada, actually happened to be visiting my grandparents. We got stopped at a checkpoint, and we were about a mile from home, and we had US passports. We don't have Palestinian residency. We don't have hawiyas or anything like that. So showing and saying, we're US citizens, we need to be able to cross back, and saying that your passport means nothing in this country. Your US, once you enter this country, your passport means nothing here because you're a Palestinian. And never really being understood here, people not being familiar with the Palestinian situation, the story, the country, and trying to teach people when we were living here about being Palestinian, what it meant to be Palestinian, what it meant to be under occupation. Just in my own high school experience, sharing like the daily life of a Palestinian in a class, and getting a 3-day suspension for expressing the daily life of Palestinian children, getting arrested and shot at. And my parents were never asked about it. I was never questioned about it. It was just automatically assumed that I had done something wrong, and having to advocate for myself and being strong enough to do that. So I think part of being Palestinian, whether it's inside the United States or living in Palestine, is that you have to be able to advocate for yourself, and you have to have a voice to tell people your story, because mainstream media, government, educational institutions are not doing that job. They're not expressing any truth in terms of what we experience. So that's our lived experience. I think especially in this latest assault on Gaza, a lot of people are learning about what's happening in Palestine, and they're surprised. Wait a second, they just released a 15-year-old who was in jail for 8 years. So why was he arrested in the first place? Oh, we know children are arrested. We know that children are held without charge and without any day in court, but it's new to a lot of people. So having to just tell our story, I think it's comforting now that people are starting to listen. I've attended, my father came here, protested the Vietnam War when he came in the 60s. As a college student, I was protesting the wars that Iraq and the other wars that were happening around the time I was in college, and now attending protests with my own children about what's happening in Palestine, and just seeing how the crowd has changed for me, even in the Bay Area over the last few weeks, seeing the crowds double and quadruple, and looking around and seeing a lot of diversity, a lot of American Jews joining the protests, I think has been really comforting, because I've always felt that on our part as Palestinians, existence is resistance. So we continue to keep our traditions, teach our children history, hold on to our culture, our way of life, what's, olive oil and all picking tree from our trees and things like that. But for the public, it's for me been about getting Americans and especially the American Jewish community to voice their opposition to what Israel is doing and what the Zionist plan is. It has to come from within. I really feel like that because, like you said, we historically we've been a silenced group. We don't have advocates. Even within our own people, our own government hasn't really been together enough to really advocate effectively on behalf of the Palestinian people. We don't have a structured form of resistance. We don't have armies. So we can continue to exist as Palestinians and have families and hope that they survive. But it's really on other communities to give us, to be self-reflective and recognize the wrong that's being committed against our people. And I think that's what I'm seeing now. I think that's finally happening. I think that's something that you've also mentioned. Just being able to have, Sheikh Hamza Zaytuna have this type of event where our history is being told and shared. And, it's really comforting. It's something welcomed. It's something I appreciate and I'm thankful for. But I know that you've been doing this work in journalism for a long time, and I appreciate that. I appreciate that about you. I have a lot of family members who are big fans of the work that you do and appreciate your efforts as well. So I wish you were here so I can properly thank you for the work that you do. But yeah, it's interesting. We've always heard stories from my grandfather always told us that when he was living in Palestine, they were neighbors with Jewish families. They traded, they worked together, they ate the same fruits and vegetables from the vendors, and things changed. During the 1967 war, he had to take 10 children, his wife and sister, and walk to a safe place where they weren't going to be bombed. And I look now at images of what families are having to do. Carrying their children, carrying their whatever belongings they can manage to hold on to and leave their homes. It's very overwhelming when you hear things like dozens of family members are passing. And you try to explain that to the American public who don't have, I have 24 cousins on my father's side, and I know them all very well, and they have their children. I know my family very well. Not to have that perspective, not to have that. So imagine sometimes I tell people, imagine the whole school was bombed or your whole neighborhood. You may not know your family, but at least imagine that just nobody's there anymore.
Yeah. And they often live together.
Yeah.
One of the really beautiful traditions that they had before all of this madness was that if they had children on the same day, and people of the Hala or the Hayy, they would actually make them brothers or sisters, and that was irrespective of the religion.
When you take down one building, it's the grandfather, all of his sons, all of likely his daughters, the grandchildren, and the great-grandchildren in one shot. And what that does to a people who value family so much, it's such an important part of who we are. But I'll say, I will say that in terms of hope and I know you said like the curse of being Palestinian, but really we believe in God. And I think that's what carries a lot of Palestinians. We believe that what comes is from God, and it's our duty to be patient and understand that ultimately there will be accountability and there will be relief. So, when I hear like Palestinian mothers in Gaza say that their children are asking them if it hurts when they get bombed.
Mm-hmm.
And, I have 3 children, and I just think like, you don't want anything to happen to your child.
Yeah, that's another really horrific trope, this idea that, it's a death cult. And these people don't care about their children. You know, the pain that you see, and often these kind of performative displays, which are really attempts to mask something because they want to show the strength and fortitude, but this idea that they don't suffer, you know, that they want death. I mean, Hamas told them to stay, and you could clearly see everybody was leaving, you know, so I think they want to live. It's just a lie to say that these people somehow have this death wish. They want to, I mean, you wrote that letter, which I hope everybody listens to. It was beautifully read by Eunice Wong, but you wrote that letter. You know, maybe talk a little bit what inspired you to write that letter about, you know, it was a letter to the children of Gaza.
Yeah, Letter to the Children of Gaza, which my wife, who's an actor, read. You can find it at chrishedges.substack.com. There's no paywall, so you can get it. Well, I was flying. I was going to go to Rafah. The Egyptians didn't let me get in, but I spent so much of my life in Palestine and carry all of the, you know, heartache and emotions that you both have. And I didn't want to do nothing. So I sat up all night on the plane and listened to it, because she's, you know, she brings out the emotional power of it. It's only 7 minutes long. But yes, of course, that's true. And, you know, go back to the Vietnam War, and they would make the same kinds of callous comments about Vietnamese, that they don't love their children the way that we do. They don't. It's a death cult. I mean, this is standard practice for all settler colonial projects, because when you seek to suppress an indigenous population as brutally as Israel has, and we could argue that this may turn out to be even worse than the Nakba in terms of numbers. 750,000 Palestinians were ethnically cleansed. 1947, 1948, several dozen massacres, Deir Yassin and other places. But, you know, in terms of scale, and I know Bibi Netanyahu, I know some of the figures in this government. I think we have to take their rhetoric very seriously. And, you know, the one point we didn't make is that Gaza is a very tiny place. It's only 20 miles long and 5 miles wide. I was in Sarajevo during the war, and we were hit with 300 to 400 shells a day, along with constant sniper fire. So that was about 3 to 4 dead a day, 24 wounded a day. And I don't want to minimize that. I still have nightmares about it. But you have to juxtapose that with Gaza, where upwards of 100, sometimes 160 children a day are being murdered. And they don't really know the numbers because, of course, so many people are missing, trapped under the rubble. But it gives you a sense of the savagery, the scale. And you would have to go back to, I don't know, you know, Chechnya maybe, Mariupol, maybe Stalingrad. I mean, we're talking about a level of bombardment that is certainly unlike anything we've seen in this century. And they're civilian. I mean, you could probably make a pretty good case that Israel's killed more UN workers than they've killed members of Hamas.
You know, the last chapter of this book, he makes a really interesting point about, you know, this idea of, you know, Zionists have insisted, referring to the state's declaration of independence, that Israel could be and was both Jewish and democratic. As the contradiction inherent in this formula grew ever more apparent, some Israelis admitted, indeed even declared with pride, that they were forced to choose. If they were forced to choose, the Jewish aspect would take precedence. And I think, you know, it's very interesting to me that you know, in some ways, the idea of an ethno-state is a complete anachronism because of the nature of the world that we live in today. I mean, we can just see these massive demographic shifts that have occurred all over the planet. And so, to hold on to this idea of an ethno-state, which obviously, there are some benefits to having, like Japan is arguably a pretty strong ethno-state, but even within Japanese culture, they have their own distinctions. Like Okinawa's not the same as mainland. They have different ethnicities within the Japanese culture itself, and China's the same way. And heterogeneity is one of Aristotle's 11 causes of civil war, that when you do have different groups. So, but you've got 6 million Palestinians. If you look at the 2 million that are in Israel itself, and then the 4 million, and it's a very significant number as far as, I find it very interesting that, we believe in God. The fact there are 6 million Palestinians, that is a significant number for Jewish people. And he ends this book by saying, there has to be a solution, and it can't be the elimination of these people. And this idea somehow that, the Arabs, because they framed it in this idea of Arabs never really giving the Palestinians this identity of being Palestinians, which they are. And as you know, you've traveled in many places in the Arab world, even though they're linguistically united relatively, they're very, I know several Arabic dialects, and they're very different. They're very different cultures. There's a lot of unity, but they're very different. Moroccan culture is very different from Gulf culture. These are not, quote unquote, one people. They're very distinct. Even within, if you go to Morocco, northern Morocco is a very different culture from southern Morocco. Sus, the Amazigh are different from the Arabs. Egypt, Saidis are very different from Alexandrians, who are different from people from Cairo. These distinctions are very powerful. And this idea somehow, well, you've got plenty of Arab countries you can go to, just leave us this country. That seems to me to be a really unreasonable argument.
Well, of course it is. These, as you point out, they have their own distinct national identities, and which are often antagonistic. Linguistically, they may be united, although I don't understand. I studied Arabic, Levantine Arabic. I don't understand much of what any Moroccan who speaks Arabic says. But yes, of course, they are. And you have countries like Egypt. These are their national identity. Arguably goes back like the Persians, goes back millenniums. But that, again, it's part of the caricature. It's part of the kind of demonization of Muslims and Arabs, as if they're all one homogeneous group, and of course an inferior group if you look at it from the perspective of the Israelis. Israel was never set up as a democracy, certainly not for Palestinians, even those Palestinians who held Israeli citizenship, and they're either treated like second-class citizens, or if you go to Gaza, they're treated as like prisoners.
He ends this with some of his suggestions. And one of the things, he says that the Palestinians cannot afford to remain divided, and there really is their leadership. If you look at the PLO, the actual members and the different groups, because you've got everything from Marxist to Ba'athist to socialist members of that group. So they're not unified in terms of just ideas. And then even within the Muslim community, there are very different iterations of Islam. But he makes an argument that unity is really, really important. And I think that's something, even though tragically, I think in some ways, the Netanyahu, well, let me rephrase that so people don't misunderstand it, that tragically this happened at a time when that government was about to collapse. Mm-hmm. And this was kind of the best thing that could have happened. And I know there's been a lot of speculation that the 6-hour lag time and the fact that, there were such egregious security breaches. I mean, there are some people that kind of feel that maybe something happened. Now we're coming out. I mean, one of the things that I mentioned when I first spoke about this was the Ponsonby report. Are you familiar with that? It was done by, after World War I, it was done by a member of parliament in 1921. And I found out about it from one of the Midford sisters. I saw an interview with one of the Midford sisters, and the interviewer asked, how could have you been fooled by Hitler? And she said, well, everybody had read the Ponsonby report, so we figured a lot of it was just propaganda. So I ended up finding the Ponsonby report, and it's an amazing document that basically they exposed, and it's something you have to love about Western culture, is that they often do expose all the evil that they do after they do it. But this book is fascinating because it documents all the lies the British government told the British people during World War I. Among them, this idea the Huns were stabbing Belgian babies, and that first report of 40 beheaded babies. And then also, apparently, it looks like a lot of the casualties may have actually been caused by Apache helicopters that were indiscriminately just shooting these cars that probably had some Israeli. So we're in the fog of war. And I think it's always wise to kind of be very careful about what you and as a real journalist, how much false journalism there is out there, and the fact that even the intelligence agencies have their own journalists that they use to plant stories and do all these things. So one of the things that he argues, and this is something that Malcolm X argued in 1964 in his famous autobiography, he said the Arabs need public relations. So that was in 1964. So like 50 years later, it still seems to be a major PR problem. And do you have any suggestions on, helping?
The problem is that these powerful moneyed forces, you see it with these wealthy donors at universities, Harvard, Columbia, UPenn. Presidents have groveled before these, wealthy Zionists, because they don't work for the university, they work for these wealthy people on the trustee boards. These are the same people that own the media. And look at the statements that have come from CNN, the hierarchy of CNN, the hierarchy of MSNBC. They pay, you may get an occasional report on Gaza, but I would say 80-90% of the information is filtered through Israel. It's spokespeople, it's victims, it's and that, of course, I think especially among a younger generation, they realize how bankrupt the media is. So part of the problem is just finding the platform, and the diversity of platforms in social media has improved this somewhat, but just finding a platform by which you can speak a truth that defies the dominant narrative is extremely difficult.
One of the things that I really hope that just there's more people within the Jewish community, and there are many very decent people that see the problems here within that community. But I think, we were always challenged to condemn our extremists, which we did vociferously since 2001. I mean, I lost my children's childhood traveling around the world. I went to Denmark when that fiasco happened, and met with the Danish heads of state about the crisis that they had with the cartoons. That's what I was doing, going around like, this is not Islam, these are extremists. And I think I really feel the Jewish community has to condemn their extremists, because, Kharem, which is this idea, the Amalek, the Amalekites, which I know you know well because you know the Bible very well, but a lot of people don't know you're a reverend, but I like to remind people, and that you have a degree in theology from Harvard University. So, but, the Amalekites, I mean, that's the word that Netanyahu used. Remember the Amalek, what we're going to do to the Amalek. And the Amalek in Samuel, it's told to kill every man, woman, and child and leave nothing breathing. And that's what they call in this culture dog whistling, right? I mean, they always use that term, this is Trump dog whistling or so-and-so dog whistling. But that's quite a dog whistle because most people don't know who the Amalek are. He said it in Hebrew. But cherem, which is not mainstream Judaism, this idea that you can just wipe out people. I mean, they have very strict laws. And interestingly, in Surah Al-Ma'idah, when it quotes the oral Mishnah, when it quotes the Mishnah, because the Quran says about Cain and Abel, for that reason, we have prescribed for Bani Israel that whoever kills a life without justification or corruption in the earth, it's as if they've killed all of humanity. And whoever brings life to one life, it's as if they brought life to all of humanity. That which is quoting Jewish scripture. And, I've seen these Jews that have written saying, oh, well, that's not Muslim doctrine. But that is Muslim doctrine, even though it says we prescribe for Bani Israel. We have something called Ash-Shar'u min qablana, that there are things from the Sharias of people before us that are included in Islamic law. And that's one of them, that we understand that is a truth. But what's interesting to me is in the Mishnah, there is, in one version, it says, whoever saves a Israeli life, it's as if they've saved all of Israel. So, or all of humanity, like the Israeli life, that is considered something that's not in the original text. So the Quran is quoting the original text. And I think this is the demarcation, the extremist Jews and the extremist Muslims that have this exceptionalism, this idea somehow that they are above everybody else and that they can kill people with impunity. Whether it's Muslims doing it in a distorted name of Islam or whether it's Jewish zealots doing it in a distorted name of Judaism, that has to be condemned from both sides. Like, I want to hear the Jewish voices condemning these extremists as well, because some of these settlers, I mean, they really sound terrifying, and you can see them, like, they say things now, they're being recorded and put up, and you even have people within the cabinet that have said really genocidal things. So they can say, oh, we're not committing genocide, but there are people in there that clearly seem to be arguing for genocide.
Oh, I think the statements are very clear. We're going to turn Gaza into a parking lot. This is a second Nakba. These are all from government ministers. Yeah, the language is genocidal, and what they're carrying out in terms of the military obliteration, certainly of the North, and I don't think they're going to stop with the North, is genocide, cutting off the food and the water and the fuel. I mean,
which are war crimes. These are, yeah. And also the 750,000 settlers that we know of in the occupied territories, which is again prohibited under international law. You cannot settle people in territories that you occupy. So on a hopeful note, the Ecuadorian legal system just returned some traditional land to an indigenous people in the Amazon forest that they lost in the Ecuadorian-Peruvian War back in the 1940s. Unfortunately, there's only 800 left in the tribe, but small victory. Are you open to taking a few questions from some of the people?
Take a few.
Great.
Sheikh Hamza, just when it comes to Q&A, we also had Hala Hijazi lined up.
I want to bring Hala in just to give some, we can do that now. In fact, Chris is open to that because Hala is you know, Hala's lost 30 members of her family. Anyway, she's been a friend, and her father was a dear friend of mine, and still is. But they're from Gaza, and but Hala's been, she's been just advocating for decades now, at least a few decades, and has worked in the Democratic Party in particular. But I think she really understands the ins and outs of how this system works. And it's one of the things that Rashid Khalidi really points out, is that the Palestinians never really understood the importance of lobbying, the importance of the vote in the United States, the importance of public relations, and getting their narrative. So I wanted her maybe to talk a little bit about maybe some of the things that people could do. So I want something practical to come out of this also, because I mean, understanding it is really important, and not many people have the time, the energy, and the resources to actually do the type of deep dive that you've done, Chris, and we honor you for that, and for your voice that you've just put forward. But also, it's something that I've been doing the last couple months, and it's been a very illuminating experience for me, to really, I just really wanted to get to the bottom of this and understand it at a deep level, because it seems to me it's such a fundamental, Willy Brandt, and you're old enough to remember the North-South, but he really understood something about what's wrong with this planet. And when you look at the UN resolutions, and the UN resolutions, I mean, it's like a gaggle of geese making a resolution against winter because they have to go south. I mean, there's just not a whole lot that comes out of these resolutions. But the importance of just understanding this, I think, and getting it into a kind of succinct narrative where people can just see, it's not complicated. At one level, it's actually quite straightforward. So, Hala, welcome.
Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. You were not supposed to get emotional, Sheikh Hamza.
I know. I apologize. Yeah.
I got to get emotional too. I think it's over close to 100 people from my extended family that's been killed so far. We have a large family. We've been in Gaza for generations, before 1948, and so we have roots there, and so we're very devastated. But at the same time, we have taqwa, and we have hearts, and we have faith, and we have to be strong for all of them, for all of them. And also, for me, I don't condone any killing of any innocent life, regardless of who it is. We work in this multi-faith communities that we work in, so we value all of life, and we must protect it. But I'm not here just as a more of an interfaith person. I'm here to kind of talk about some of the things that we can do. First of all, I want to say I am so proud of the community. I am so proud of the Muslim Arab community and allies. I've been doing this work for 25 years, and I have never seen, as devastating as this war and the situation has been for 2 months, I have never seen this community come together for something, because this is no longer about Gazans or Palestinians or Muslims. It's about humanity, and it's about human rights, and it's about just the dignity of life and dignifying life. And so to see the community, kids and 80-year-olds, protesting and marching has been a very, very powerful thing. And so I am so proud. So I just want to start by saying, this has really brought this community together in a way that I have never seen it ever before. So alhamdulillah, and thank you to all that have been going to protest and doing that. So I just want to just brush, and we can do a separate conversation, but just want to kind of give you a macro level of the importance and why you see certain groups succeeding more, having more power than others. Is really because of relationships. In our civil and political societies, cultivating and sustaining relationships are critical. And having diverse and as many relationships and allies as possible is really power. And I believe this is where we need to do more and better. And I really want to just talk about a few areas around family, around places of worship, around philanthropic efforts, and then, of course, around politics and engaging our public officials. The one thing about this country is built on two numbers: number of votes and number of dollars raised. So when you're talking, regardless if you're a Republican or Democrat or whatever you are, this country is really about the people that win, and the people that have power know how to count those. But the one good thing about this, about numbers, is that we as Muslims and as Arabs and people of faith are growing in large numbers. And I think one thing they underestimate is because we're Muslim, we're Black Muslim, we're Chinese Muslim, we're white Muslim, we're Latino Muslim, we're Asian Muslim, we're Pakistani Muslim. And many of us don't say we're Muslim. Like under the census, it doesn't have different categories. So sometimes we're not, we're not categorized. And so they don't realize that we are really impacting. Biden won in 2020 because of three main categories of people: the women, the Black vote, and the Muslim vote. If he did not win Michigan, he would have lost. Michigan was critical, and it was because of the Muslim and Arab vote. And so I think that's why you're seeing a lot of articles and news about the fact that a lot of people are upset right now, and he may lose his reelection because of the Muslim and Arab vote. And not just in Michigan, we're talking about Virginia, Arizona, Pennsylvania. And then we were talking down the ballot, we're talking about Ohio and Texas, and we're talking about Florida. So I want you guys to know, like, our voices matter, our votes matter. And I know some people are really upset now, and they're like, we're not going to vote. You need to vote. I'm not telling you who to vote for, but you need to show our numbers. And right now, it's a really critical time in our country's history to show our power, especially our power, because the truth is, we've never had a seat at the table. And Sheikh Hamza knows this, whether it's me or others, we've had to create our own tables. And that's what we're doing right now. And so, first of all, when it comes to family, I think one missing component is our families. We don't sit around the table and say, hey, let's read the ballot. Let's see who's affecting us. School board races are critical. That is the entryway. Most people think, oh, it's just a school board. I don't have children, or my children is grown. But those school board races are so important because they end up running for mayor. Then that's his platform and a stage where they run for assembly or state senate and then governor. So we need to, as a family, really have those dinner conversations around the table about why it is important for if you're in Sunnyvale or in San Ramon, regardless of where you are, those races are critical. And so as a family, I think we need to do that. The other part about family is that a lot of us in the Muslim community, and I fight this with a lot of my friends, they want the kids to go to medical school, law school, accounting, tech. We really need to get our little children to start thinking about being journalists, working for the government. We need to have better representation. And I really love Islamic Scholarship Fund, really love what Zaytuna College are doing, but we really need to start creating a pipeline for the PR part of this that Chris Hedges is talking about. And so I really encourage you guys to think of ways of how to diversify our pipeline for students so that they have more to look at. And the other one is places of worship. We have, alhamdulillah, in California, amazing places of worship, especially in Santa Clara, where Sheikh Hamza lives, and then in LA. The reality is we do a lot of internal facing, but we're not doing external facing events. We need to really open our places of worship. We need to start having community iftars that are for non-Muslims. I know we do it once in a while, but we really need to do it not just also when we're in crisis mode, but also just for happier times. The other thing that's important, we need to desegregate our places of worship. In San Francisco in particular, we just have the Yemeni that just does Yemeni, then the Iraqi, then the Black. We really need to do a better job of desegregating and doing more of a multi-faith engagement and invite the Jewish members of our community, our Hindus, our Christian and Catholic. I think the problem is right now, everyone has gone to their corners, and this is not also healthy, because we really need to establish relationships with them and show them who we are. I say this all the time, like, We as Muslims, we are a beautiful people. We are generous. We are hospitable. We are humble. We would give you the shirt off our backs. We would give you the food off our plates. So we need to show non-Muslims, non-Arabs, that's who we are. That we are not what the media is trying to portray us to be, or a small group of powerful right-wing racists, what they're trying to show. So please, like, one of the things that we need to do more is open your hearts and open your doors so that we're invite your neighbors. Even if it's a hard thing to do, invite them, include them in your at your homes, at your Eid parties, at your picnics. Choose. And I also say this, like, we need to have allies. It hurts me when Muslims and Arabs are not hanging out with their African American friends or their Latino friends or their Filipino friends. This is where we are at a disadvantage, where the other folks, that's what they're doing. They're everywhere. And they look like they're the hospitable and they're the righteous. And no, but we are too. We need to do more and be better at that. So please, I really encourage all of you, if you have cultural centers or places of worship that you're leading, to do more of that. And then about community and philanthropic initiatives. The other thing that we're not doing is we're not doing philanthropy outside. We need to start doing more with, like, the American Red Cross or the American Cancer Society. You guys say, well, that's not politics, but it is. This is where a lot of these major sponsors and fundraisers and donors to buildings and to City Hall and to politicians are also the chairs of these organizations. And we need to have more of us working in these spaces, joining boards, volunteering, giving blood. And again, we need to be more active. And so when we call on them, when there's a problem on a board of supervisor issue, or when we have a visual and we need them to come to one of our prayer services, that they have an existing relationship with us, that they feel comfortable, that we also feel like we're in a safe environment where we can lean on them in our time of need. And I really, really implore you to do more around philanthropy. We are, as Pew Research have shown for the past couple of decades, that the Jewish community, the Muslim community, are the most giving, generous communities in this country. And the problem is with us, we're only giving it mostly to Muslim organizations and masajid, and to Muslim causes. But we really need to also start showing our power and our strength by giving money also elsewhere, so that we can cultivate those relationships. And again, all this is political. Like, again, everything that we're doing is political. This is not, it's not just about voting. As our Prophet ﷺ said, his just walking is political, and engaging and having these conversations with people that don't look like you and that don't believe it the same way that you do. And I think we need to do more of that. And now to the part that everyone is waiting for, about politics. Engagement is really, really key right now. One of the things that we're missing, I'll just talk about what we're missing and then go back to some practical things. We do not have, and I just want to say this loudly, we do not have a major political action committee. We don't. There's like one or two in the country. They're small. They only come around every 4 years. We need to, like, unlike AIPAC or Democratic Majority for Israel, there's like hundreds of political action committees that do fundraisers for mayors, to Congress people, to the president. So the problem is, we have so much money, we have so much resources, we are so qualified on so many different things, but we have not created a political action committee, whether it's local, regional, or national, to compete with that. And unfortunately, as Chris said, the power comes where money, and until we change the political system or the lobbying system, we're going to be at a disadvantage. So I encourage all of you. I know there are a lot of people that are talking about political action committees. I think it's really important to think thoughtfully. Me personally, I'm working on one. Inshallah, it'll be like, for me, after this situation, I am dedicating and rededicating my life to this, because I know this. I breathe this every day. And so instead of me raising money just to raise money, I have raised, alhamdulillah, over $2 million for causes. But this time is personal, and this time we have to be more strategic about how do we raise money and who we give this money to. So political action committee. So if you guys are interested to create your own, that's really important. But the more important things right now that you guys already are doing, but we need to do more of, is we need to start meeting regularly with your mayor. Regularly. Like in San Francisco, I'll give you a poignant example. In San Francisco, we have regular meetings with the district attorney's office. We have regular meetings with the police chief. We have regular meetings sometimes with the FBI. We have regular meeting with the attorney general. We have established relationship. So when someone like me sees a crazy post by an elected official, I can call them on their cell phone and say, hey, do you understand that either you or your staff just tweeted something racist, Islamophobic, and calling our protesters pro-Hamas protesters is an abomination to anything democratic? Those are things that are happening, and we're not going to be able to make those phone calls and have them take down those tweets if we're not organized. And from now on, establishing relationship when there's no crisis. The problem with the community, we only run to them and yell and scream and lose our minds when we're confronted with wars or the Muslim ban. We need to, from day one, and inshallah, whether it started October 7th or 8th or starting tomorrow, you guys need to start from now on, regardless of the city you live in. It is power. Even if you get rejected, you are a constituent, and we will help you. We're going to start rolling out talking points and words that you need to be using, trigger words that inshallah will get the response that you like. So again, the most important thing, honestly, right now, especially relates to this war, you need to contact the governor's office. You need to contact, I don't know if you've noticed, but the University of California, right? The university has 10 of the best, most important universities in the world right now. The problem is right now, they have ADL and APAC and JCRC and briefing notes from God knows where that are telling them their children and only their children are in harm's way, that their children are feeling safe, that their children are the only ones that are being impacted, while our children are the one being stabbed to death, shot, or ran over. So their response, this is the response of universities recently, is like, well, the Muslim community is not reaching out to us. So why should we provide resources if there's a problem, we would assume they're reaching out to us. So you guys need to understand, when you get mad at certain people, you can't get mad also, because if we're not making the effort, if we're not holding them accountable, then that would be a problem. So I really encourage you to start email campaigns directly. This is public information. You are paying taxes. Your taxes are literally employing the mayors, the district attorneys, the city attorneys. You need to have a cheat sheet. Every city, every community center, every masjid needs to have a cheat sheet of the police, from the mayor to the police chief to the emergency service response unit to the Department of Public Health. The other important thing is language. One thing I realized that our community would do better is if we start, every city needs to now enact, make sure that if Arabic is missing, if you have a large population, right now, just, in San Francisco, anything that goes out through Department of Public Health, we made sure that it's in Arabic and sometime in Urdu, and we pass it out to the masajid and to cultural organizations. And so those are really, really important things that you guys need to consider. The other thing that some of you are not as comfortable with is working on campaigns right away. Even if you don't like the candidate, you need to start understanding the process and the way they think. So I really think it's important. And then the other one thing that a lot of you don't like to do is fundraising. Now, the reason fundraising is important is that's unfortunately how this game is played. I'm just going to be honest with you. I just attended a major event with Biden in San Francisco, and half of the people on there was from lobbying groups. Half. There was, I don't have $125,000 or $250,000 a co-host and put my name Hala Hijazi or the Muslim community or whatever. But half of the people on that host committee are the people that are telling him no ceasefire. Just listen to that. Sorry.
Yeah, we're running out of time, and I just wanted to get Chris to just maybe host a couple of questions and then, but I really appreciate I know you've been working tirelessly for a long time in this area, and you're one of our community's probably, most knowledgeable people about how this system works. So I think, we should take seriously your advice and what you're saying. Gibran?
Bismillah. So here's one question. Khalidi's book is distinguished by its usage of manuscript and other primary sources, something that's not always found in books exploring topics like this on contemporary geopolitics and so on. Which of these insights were novel to you as someone who is an expert in the topic?
So yeah, I agree. That is part of that gives the book a lot more texture, because his family was a very prominent Palestinian family that dealt directly with the Zionist settler movement, and he had relatives who had prominent positions, and he uses it to describe the relationship between the Zionist settlers and members of his family and how duplicitous they were, how they worked very, very hard to mask the settler colonial project that they privately knew was going to lead to the expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians and the seizure of Palestinian land and property. So that was really interesting. And I think the other thing is that most of his family was very highly educated, and at the time, certainly if you go back a century ago, a large number of the inhabitants in historic Palestine were probably not even literate, and he contrasts that. So his relatives, he had one relative who spoke fluent German and understood completely because he could read the Austrian press. He could read the kinds of things Chaim Weizmann was writing and saying, but how that lack of that educational disparity, he uses his personal family to show how that lack of understanding made it very difficult for the Palestinians, the indigenous inhabitants of Palestine, to understand what was happening to them.
Thank you. Another question we had was, do you think the fallout and scale of recent events might mean a reset in foreign policy in the Middle East? The UK already has made some indications in this direction through the comments of the new Foreign Secretary, former Prime Minister David Cameron.
Well, the only way to get a reset is to recalibrate the relationship between Washington and Jerusalem, and I don't see that happening. The power of the Israel lobby is such not only that it funds candidates and is able to exert tremendous control within institutions, universities, the media, and everything else, but of course it uses its resources to destroy those who stand up like Rashid Khalidi and speak out on behalf of Palestinian human rights and denounce the genocide. I mean, AIPAC has just announced that they're spending $100 million to go after Rashid Khalidi and a handful of others who have had the courage to stand up to these Israeli war crimes and call them out for what they are. So unfortunately, the system itself is one of legalized bribery, and the power of the Israel lobby is not so much that it has a lot of popular support within the Democratic Party. It doesn't, actually, but it has money, and it uses it to essentially shut down any debate and make sure that whichever party, I mean, look, we have to be clear that Obama had a very strained relationship with Netanyahu, who was tried to sabotage his Iran nuclear deal and got himself invited to Congress behind Obama's doing an end run around Obama to denounce it. When Biden was vice president, he was humiliated by Netanyahu. They called for restraining settlement expansion, and the day he was in Jerusalem, they just expanded it. Netanyahu doesn't care if Biden becomes collateral damage because he gets Trump. In many ways, Biden is kind of hostage to this. I mean, look, he sent his Secretary of State Blinken around the Arab world like an errand boy, begging Arab heads of state to take ethnically cleansed Palestinians. I mean, they shut the door in his face. It was kind of humiliating. And we know from the latest appropriation that there's a line item in there for resettlement. So we're going to have to really, re-engineer the entire political system, because I'm a strong supporter of BDS, because like South Africa, once we sever those ties, that's going to create the kind of pressure that's going to force Israel into a settlement they may not want, but one that hopefully will be more equitable to the Palestinians.
I think also one of the things that just is really ignored in this is just what Eisenhower appropriately called the military-industrial complex, and the amount of money involved, and the kind of need for these conflicts to keep this game going. China had a very small budget, military budget, but because they felt so threatened, they're catching up to the United States. They did not put a lot of their money into their military, but we've got another arms race. And I think also the fiasco in Ukraine, and I know you have been opposed, and I was horrified. I mean, Ukraine was bad enough, because the average age of the Ukrainian soldiers is 43. They've massacred a whole generation of Ukrainian young men. And and they knew it all along, that they knew that it was a no-win situation, but bleed Russia. Russia's as Churchill said, the riddle wrapped in an enigma, the riddle wrapped in an enigma sealed in a mystery. It's been the boogeyman for so long. And to keep this game going, John Carroll's book, The Abode of War, about America. And the other thing that Eisenhower, and I really think that speech is probably one of the most important speeches in American history, his farewell address. They always tell the truth when they're leaving office, but the other thing that people, I think, miss on that speech, because they always quote the military industrial, but he had two warnings. And the other was the co-option of our university system by corporations, and the fact that technology now and the research industry was no longer the solitary scientist in his garage tinkering with an invention, but with this massive federally aided research and funding, which would destroy the intellectual freedom of our universities. I mean, that was his second warning. So I just, I'm kind of concluding in some ways at my late age in life that we're in almost like a malevolent Truman show, because like at least Truman, they had a nice town that he lived in, and he had a relatively nice life, even though he was in a prison. But this kind of prison that people are putting in with big pharma, big agriculture, and then the armaments industry, give them food that makes them sick, give them drugs that basically just maintain their sickness, enable them to live with their sickness, and then have wars from time to time to keep this fear, and everybody's in this state of fear. When the reality of it is most people, I mean, I've been around long enough, I'm in my 7th decade, on this planet. Most people, if you treat them with dignity, they reciprocate. That's 99% of the, there's a malevolent 1%, they're demons. I mean, Susan Sontag said that, 10% of the world was cruel and 10% was merciful, and the other 80 were swayed by one group or the other. And maybe there's some truth in that. But my experience is most people really are decent, that want to live in peace. They don't want wars, and so these warmongers are just, They are the enemy.
Thank you. We had a question for Sheikh Hamza as well. It's, in this state of tribulation, are there particular dua and adhkar that you would recommend that Muslims engage in for the protection of the people of Al-Quds?
I mean, there's a lot of du'as from the Prophet, and one of the best ones is where he asks that أقسم لنا من خشيتك ما تحول بيننا وبين معصيك ومن طاعتك ما تبلغ به جنتك ومن اليقين ما تهون علينا مصائب الدنيا. Give me a certainty that makes the tribulations of this world insignificant in my eyes, my experience. I mean, that's a really important dua. And then we ask, that peace prevail. I mean, the Prophet asked for peace 5 times a day, and we should be out there, really promoting peace. And Juan Cole's edited a really important book about the peace movements in Islam. People see Islam as a religion of war and violence, which is a lie. Juan Cole's written a beautiful book called Muhammad, Prophet of Peace. And, he's making an argument as a world-class historian that the documents, the tradition, everything shows that the Prophet avoided war whenever he could. He was not a warmonger, and he asked God for peace, and he wanted to see peace in the world. So I think we should really, I'm totally anti-war. I'm not anti-self-defense. I believe in self-defense. But modern warfare, as Caleb Carr shows in his book, The History of Terror, which is a history of warfare against civilians, modern warfare, 90% of the victims of modern warfare are civilians. And nobody knows this better than Chris Hedges, who for decades went around the world witnessing firsthand. And I know, like Sam Keane in his Faces of the Enemy, you saw the demonization and what follows always after this demonization of a people. That the Jews are human beings, and we assert their humanity. We believe in the truths of the great Jewish prophets. We are commanded by God to believe in Moses and in David and then in the prophet of the Christians, Jesus. That this is an obligation on us. And we see there's a tradition we have where Adam smiles and grimaces, and he was asked about it, and he smiled when he saw his children righteous, and he grimaced when he saw them shedding blood. And so we forget the Jewish people are children of prophets. And we would want good for the children of prophets. I mean, these are the children of Isaac and Jacob, and we would want to see them. And the Quran says, the Quran says to Bani Israel, you're not on a sound footing unless you implement your Torah, which is about justice. And that's why so many of the Jewish people have been motivated by justice. I mean, we know the history of this country and the role that the Jewish community played in so many of the social justice movements. The Columbia law professor who was, Barbara Oshansky and Mark Rittner, he was a Jewish law professor that I interviewed after 9/11. He was defending the Guantanamo people. This was a professor at Columbia University. And when I asked him why he was doing that, he said, in our tradition, we have something called the tzaddik, which is in Arabic siddiq. It's the righteous person that believes in truth and justice and righteousness. And he said, I saw nobody was defending them, and they needed defense. And so my desire to be a tzaddik, to be a truthful person, is what motivated me to do that. And so, we as Muslims, we have to really beware of demonizing, our Jewish brothers and sisters, and recognize that there are many, many people that are on the side of truth and justice. And many of them also are just, they've they've had a lot of propaganda. They've grown up in environments where they don't know, the whole story. They know part of the story.
Sheikh Hamza, we are just about getting to the 2-hour mark.
Chris, do you have any final words that you'd like to say?
No, I think we've covered it. I mean, when you live, as I did, in countries like Palestine, you stop using these terms. I don't even like particularly the term Arab. I mean, because they're friends. They're, Ahmed and, Shahira. And I mean, you eradicate all of this kind of rhetoric, which essentially is used to push people away from you. And I think that is the great blessing that I spent 20 years overseas as a foreign correspondent. And I don't even particularly think of myself as American. I find my kinship with those, and they are there in every culture and every religion, who rise up against the oppressor on behalf of the oppressed. And that is my community. And many of them are Muslim.
Thank you for that testimony. The most repeated story in the Quran is Moses and Pharaoh. And, you have to choose your side in this world. Neutrality is not an option on that one. So, anyway, I hope these are, do you want to have any?
I would just say thank you again to Dr. Hedges. I mean, what's allowed you to, I think, learn about Palestine and then and visit is what I would call people too, which is, being faithful and honoring people, being hospitable, being conscious of how you spend your money. It's being intentional. Like you mentioned, BDS, it matters who you engage with and what you support, because you're either aiding or you're not, and you're either on the side of justice or not. So I appreciate that about you. And I just continue to call on people to, like you're doing, to elevate the voice of Palestinian people. That was one of the things when I was there in the second Intifada that people asked me to do when you return to the States: tell people what we're experiencing and let them know, because they have a belief that people are good, that if they hear the truth, that they will side with them. And that's something that's, I think, the Palestinian people have held on to over the years, and everything that they've endured is that if you tell people the truth, they will side with the truth. And that's what keeps people going. And that's what allows these young people who are in Gaza to risk their lives to videotape what's happening. They believe that if you show people truth, they will support the truth. And so thank you for that. And thank you to Sheikh Hamza for the opportunity to really tell our story. Alhamdulillah.
Thank you for being here. I just want to say, I think everybody, this affects the whole globe. And one of the things, Barbara Tuchman's book on, August, the days of August, it's, one idiot fired a shot that was heard around the world. I don't think people realize the potential for a global conflagration. I mean, it's very real. And we don't want to see that. We have children, and we're people that believe in life, not in death. So I think it's really important for people to get educated about this. I saw one Jewish person, and who was advocating for Palestinians, and he was asked by the interviewer, "Are you pro-Palestinian?" He said, "No, I'm pro-truth." And I think that's a really important distinction, because if the Palestinians are wrong, we have to be against the Palestinians. The Quran says, "Be witnesses unto the truth, even against yourselves." So if they're wrong, if they killed civilians, we have to condemn that, and that's wrong. But we also have to recognize that when other sides are wrong as well, we can't be seen as a partisan thing. And also, anti-Semitism, like racism, becomes a term of abuse. And as you know, a term of abuse is only effective if it doesn't have a definition. like somebody cuts you off on the road and you say, you idiot. And the guy could be a Nobel Prize-winning professor at MIT, who's not an idiot. But the term works because it doesn't have a definition. And words have meaning. And I know you're somebody committed to that truth also. Anti-Semitism should be a real word that means something and should not be glibly thrown around to anybody that has criticisms that are legitimate, whether they be Jewish, to be called a self-hating Jew, or whether they be a Muslim or somebody, a Christian or a secularist. It's just really important. But I hope this has, been, I really appreciate you. I know you're really busy and we had to rearrange it, but I really wanted to have you on, Chris. I dedicated my book to you, The Prayer of the Oppressed, because of the work that you've done for the Palestinians. So, I hope these are ironic points of light that flash out wherever the just have changed their messages. So may I, composed of eros and of dust like them, beleaguered by the same negation and despair, just show an affirming flame. So hopefully that's what we're trying to do. Keep that. Thank you, Chris. Yeah.
Okay.
Really appreciate it.